Welcome everyone to the Classical Philosophy Podcast. With me again, as always, is Chris of Norwich. And this time, for the first time, we're recording this podcast actually live together in the same room. So I think we always used Zoom or Skype before, but this time we're sitting across from each other, so let's see if that's any different. As always, feel free to support the channel by subscribing, by supporting us on Patreon or PayPal, and of course also share the videos if you like and leave a comment. Before we begin this time this is the second half of Plato's Politeia, of the Republic, Plato's state. This time we shall read parts of Book 6, Book 7 and Book 10. So we'll go through the analogy of the line, of the sun and of the cave together, and then of course also the so-called banning of the artist. But before we start that, we both wanted to mention that we do offer tutoring. So we have private students, and maybe Chris, you can say a few words about teaching in general, and maybe also a course that we have got planned for some time next year.
Yeah, so Johannes has been doing tutoring for quite a while. He's quite experienced, and he's been encouraging me to do the same. So it sounds like a great idea. And Johannes teaches mainly Heidegger, I believe, but my area is mostly in ancient philosophy, so Plato, Aristotle, and then the Hellenic philosophers.
Yeah.
So things like Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism. Those are the main Hellenic schools. So if anyone is interested in one-to-one tutoring on those topics, then I'd be happy to accommodate them. And you can get in touch through the Halcyon Guild, I believe.
Yes. I'll leave a link just down below so people can use the contact form on our website. So Chris is a member of the Halcyon Guild, where we offer also full-on proper courses. The next course will be on Nietzsche, and something you suggested was a course on ancient philosophy, but more on less the philosophy of being and more the philosophy of, say, life, perhaps, a good life.
Yeah, so it's one thing I really like about all the Hellenic schools, as I said, Stoicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, is the focus on ethics.
Yeah.
All those schools have their own kind of physics and metaphysics, which are really important for understanding the ethics. But what I love about them is that they really do focus on philosophy as a way of being, as a way of living. And so that's, I think, what I would focus on, the ethics of those particular, those Hellenic schools, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, so that's something that we're working on that might be out sometime in 2021. But for now, Chris does offer, just like I do, the private tutoring, so that's one-on-one. So if you're interested in that, just reach out to us. And I think, if with no further ado, we shall start with Book 6. Book 6 in the Republic, or in Plato's Politeia, to use the Greek title. And it starts off with, importantly, the nature, you could say, or the soul of the philosopher, the psyche, the psyche of the philosopher, what that psyche is like and what it needs to be like. And what he says at 485, and again, maybe I should mention, I have the original Greek on the left of my edition, and on the right the translation in German by Schleiermacher, Friedrich Schleiermacher. That's a 19th century German translation, which is one of the standard translations. And you have, which one is that?
The Grube, GMA Grube. It's in the Hackett, published by Hackett.
Yeah. So we're going through this, and one of the things that you can point out immediately is that philosophers love that which is revealed, delos in Greek, that which is always, aiouses in Greek, and not that so much which is harmed by Genesis Kaiftora, which is usually translated as Entstehen und Vergehen, Genesis and demise, I would think. And they hate the fake. They hate what's a simulacrum, and they love what's true. Sophia, Aletheia, those are the words here used, and they are those are oikesteron, which means they are related. They are from the same house. Oikos means house. So it's set up in a way, Book 6, which leads on to the two analogies of the lion and of the sun, which will then lead to the cave by thinking through what it is that who is a philosopher. And they are always striving towards wisdom, philosophers that is. They are measured, they're not greedy, and the bodily remains in the background. So bodily desires are not the main focus. It is about, actually he says quite clearly, human worries or fears do not touch them. And even death is nothing to them. This is something that Book 10 will end on. And this is why the philosopher is brave and noble.
Yeah, we can kind of just remind ourselves of things we covered in the last part one of this podcast, which was that Plato talks about the soul as having three aspects, right? A rational, reason-loving aspect, an appetitive aspect, that which loves appetite.
Thumos, yeah.
And so that's the appetite, and then thumos, which is another. Which is, the word is often translated as spiritedness. Yeah. So, analogy I always like to use is victory in battle, or because this is the people who are using that part of their soul he wants as military people defending the city. So just to kind of use those tools that we discovered in the first part, philosophers are people who are using that reason-loving part of their soul. Yeah. And loving is the correct term. Is Plato talks about an eros. Mm-hmm. One of my favourite passages, which is just. Mm-hmm. We always want to remind ourselves how when you read kind of introductions to Plato or abstracts of Plato, you just don't get how brilliantly weird Plato is, and the kind of language he uses. He talks about, so this is 490b. He talks about an erotic love of the truth. It's the nature of the real lover of learning to struggle towards what is, as Johannes just said, what is, not what sometimes is and sometimes isn't, what is, not to remain with any of the many things that are to be believed to be, that as he moves on he neither loses nor lessens his erotic love until he grasps the being of each nature itself with the part of his soul, as we said, that rational loving part of his soul, that is fitted to grasp it, because of its kinship with it. So he's saying that this rational loving part of the soul is of the same nature as being, as truth. Yes. Do you want to come in?
No, go on.
So that's because of its kinship with it. So it's I don't want to leap too forward to Kant and straight this early in the podcast, but Kant talks in a similar way about what gives humans their dignity and their one of the almost the way that Kant can not dismiss religion, but make humans not dependent on religion, is that they have this kind of godlike element in their souls already, which and Plato's talking about a similar thing here with they have a truth element in their souls, and that's what allows them to grasp it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, at 490b, just to add to what Chris just said, Plato says that the philosopher can only still his love when the philosopher gets closer to that which truly is. And this then generates, he says, genesis nun kai alethean, that generates nous, which sometimes is translated as reason, sometimes as understanding, depending on the translation, and that's debatable what nous really means, but maybe sometimes it's mind. In Aristotle it's often mind. So let's just say nous and truth, aletheia, that which stands, if we want to speak with Heidegger, that which stands revealed, that which is unconcealment itself. And only then can the philosopher live truly and also overcome pain. But not before. Prin, he says, prin don du. So prin means before, but not before. And this is how a measure on the earth, to quote from Hölderlin, is found. Can there be a measure on the earth, Hölderlin asks. And it can be found, and I'll say something again I said at the Stoa. What philosophy is, and always has been, is the way in which humans articulate an access to the world. And that means to what really is and what truth is. And therefore the philosopher is necessary. And I think this is why Plato comes up with the philosopher as someone who guides, as a phylax, not someone who's a guardian and a guidance, because the philosopher obviously cares for truth, for that which stands unconcealed and that which truly is and is not just a semblance of something and removed from that which is. And there's another, as you pointed out, there are these. There's maybe a bit of a whitewashed Plato, and I know that you're interested in the Phaedrus at the moment. So that would be, Theos of, what was it, Theomania, divine madness, etc. But there's these weird passages. For example, here at 468a, Plato says, the philosopher overlooks or sees the entirety of time. So there's a theoria pantos men chronon. Theoria is here still in the old sense of the word, which means to gaze at, to look upon the entirety of chronos, of time. And it's there's a certain bravery about the philosopher, and there's the soul of the philosopher is mild, is just, or as Chris, as you translated last time, measured. I guess you said appropriateness for dikaiosune, so maybe measured, and it's not rough. And this is visible from youth onwards, Plato says. And also very important, the soul of the philosopher is not epilesmeno, which means forgetful, vergesslich in German. The soul is not forgetful. Because, as he says, a forgetful soul begins to hate philosophy. And it's always about measure. So the word measure is used quite often. Emmetria, which in German means Ebenmaß. So equilibrium would be, I guess, a word in English. It's at 468d. That's something that's and it's the ethos of the philosopher is eucharis, which means graceful. And it's actually in these descriptions of the philosopher that Adeimantos brings up against Socrates, that hence a philosopher is not useful for the state, for the polis, with such a soul. But then Socrates brings in the eikonos, the image of the ship and the captain of the ship. And yeah,
the ship of fools, it's often called.
You can.
Yeah, so Socrates, what Socrates and Adiamantus are talking about is why aren't philosophers more kind of accepted in society at the moment? What is the if as Socrates is arguing that philosophers are so clearly the best suited members of society to guard, to guide, to lead, to rule, then why in society as it is are philosophers so looked down upon? And especially if you know any of the tragedies or the literature of the time when Socrates is writing, you know just how looked down upon the philosophers are. People like the comedians especially will kind of joke about Socrates as being completely useless, and obviously wider society thought he was pretty like a bit of a pest. Just he was accosting people on the streets and just arguing with them about things which they have no interest in as they go about their daily business. Yeah. So why are philosophers so looked down upon is the question they're wrestling with.
Yeah.
And
you may answer.
Right. So Socrates says that basically it's the way that society is organised at the moment leads philosophers to be so looked down upon. The decent ones who do possess true philosophical nature are not raised under the right sort of constitution. Mm-hmm. But if the majority ever saw a philosopher who was raised under the right constitution, they would agree that he should rule.
And I think it's also very important that you brought up the streets, and that it is Socrates in what we now think of as an earlier dialogue, the Meno, for example, walking around in the streets, bothering people, and asking them, what is virtue?
Yes.
What really is arete, this untranslatable word? And I think you brought it up allows me briefly to mention something we talked about today or yesterday before recording this, which is why is it that philosophy becomes necessary? So Heraclitus does not think of himself as a philosopher, or Parmenides certainly doesn't yet. But why is there a need, there's a necessity for those who love Sophia as opposed to the self-proclaimed sophists? Yeah, so what we said was it becomes necessary, and you can jump in when you want, because the sophists had begun to marketize and brand, you could say today, and marketize, is that a word? To start selling knowledge, to start not just knowledge, but knowledge in what sense? Knowledge, or even just the thaumazein, the amazement at something, at the world, that there is, rather than there being absolutely nothing. And that's what sophistry really was. It was sophistry against philosophy, against Sophia, I mean. And hence the philosophers came up who, and this is important to understand, that this is what especially the Politeia is about. It's always trying to get to that which truly and genuinely is, and doesn't just appear to be something, or is the replication or reproduction of something that appears to be right. And up until this day we struggle with this. Walter Benjamin, for example, his main work in aesthetics is on the artwork in the age of reproduction. We'll get to more of the semblance and where Heidegger really differs from Plato, but then where he doesn't differ actually in the technology. But this is, I think, what's important is that, again, it's always coming the toon, ontos, etc. The things that really are, and those that don't just seem to be. That's what they're trying to. That's what they're trying to get to. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're still. I mean, this what this does is flesh out kind of the foundation of Plato's many opponents in this in the Republic. The Republic isn't just against one other philosophy or writer. He's writing about the abuse of philosophy, and also the pretensions that maybe other activities have about over knowledge. So Johannes has mentioned the sophists. They're really abusing philosophy by simply turning it to whatever. It's the kind of play with argument, right? If one person for a defendant hires a sophist, then they'll argue that position as well as they can. If someone else hires them to plead against an individual, then they'll use philosophy for that. They have no overarching concern with the actual truth of the case. And then you look at another opponent of the Republic as we'll get to, is playwrights, is dramatists, because they're not concerned with what actually is either. They're concerned with appearances. They're too concerned with feelings, the themos, and they're concerned with appearances, with things that are one day aren't another day, and with particulars, with particular characters. So what we're describing is the foundation of all these disagreements. None of these people have an actual concern with what is truly.
Yes, and one of the weird things to perhaps understand is that being is rare. Not everything that appears to be is. Many things, in quotation marks, just are of doxa, of mere semblance. And this is what Book 10 is about, in the beginning at least. Very often the soul is confused by the manifold contradictory doxae, which we can translate as representations or imaginations, or carefully. Maybe that's good enough. Because if we say ideas and thoughts, then we're already in that would be colloquially correct, but it wouldn't be in a philosophical dialogue.
Well, just to bring this down to some examples, I remember a good lecture I had always had some examples like, a wolf compared to a tortoise is a large animal. So take that statement, a wolf is a large animal. But compare a wolf to an elephant, and suddenly a wolf is a small animal. So this is these kind of really obvious statements that we don't really think twice about. But to Plato, these were really important, right? How can you say X is P in one day, and then the next day say X is not P? This violates the principle of non-contradiction, which was really through the whole of appearance, the life that we see around us, into doubt and into skepticism, and shows that what we're dealing with on an everyday level is not being. It's something between being and not being, but it's not eternal truth.
Well, I would say there is eternal truth.
But that's not those.
No.
Those examples I'm talking about. The world of appearance.
Yes. Okay, I would not say this is important. I think we might differ on this. I don't think there's a world of mere appearance, and then there's another world of true forms. No. It's a bit more complicated with. Yeah,
we talked about this last time. It's not like there's two realms, like a realm of and a realm of this.
Yeah.
So they talk about particulars participate in the forms.
In the universal. Yes.
Yeah. So
as a principle. Yeah. And the forms are not things.
No.
So that's. But there's something else he said. The principle of non-contradiction, which is, of course, it's actually that's articulated in that pure form by Aristotle later on. And Plato here, we might get to this, he might not, actually does engage in dialectics, but then also warns against it. And we won't touch on it just yet, but dialectics is, on the one hand, extremely important in order to get to truth itself. But on the other hand, dialectics can go terribly wrong. And we'll get to that example, which is that, the child that's raised by adopted by rich parents, and then he finds out. But we'll get to that. So there's this 4 words about at 490c, the philosopher's physis is described. It's usually translated as nature or essence, depending. But physis is that which arises out of itself. And that's not just a Heideggerian translation. That's a translation that's now, I think, commonly used usually. But physis is where you get the word physics from, and it's usually nature. So when we say that, the nature of this thing, or the nature of this particular person or something, that comes from physis, which is the self arising out of itself, and it does have the 4 following features, which are Andrea, where you get the word Andrea or Andreas from, meaning in German Tapferkeit, so I guess bravery. Megalopt, I can't read my own handwriting now. Megaloprepeia, which is a noble sense.
High-mindedness in my translation.
High-mindedness, yeah, thank you. Oimathia, eumathia, which in Mathia you have mantano, which means to learn, to understand. So that means scholarliness. I don't know what the word is here.
Ease in learning.
Ease in learning. And mnemi, or mneme, which means memory. So those are the 4 most important. Can you say the English again so that I don't...
So courage is, so you said bravery. So I think courage, high-mindedness, ease in learning, and a good memory.
Yeah, so very important. Those are the 4... That's what makes the physis of the nature of the philosopher are these 4. Good memory. And it's only when the philosopher has to care for what is his own, which is to say that he's not concerned with, in colloquial terms now, worldly affairs or affairs of base desires, as you spoke about yesterday, or just any kind of all too worldly, all too human desires perhaps, but must care for truth and must care for being, because being is rare. It's the task of the philosopher to speak almost philosophically. Heidegger says at some point the human being is the shepherd of being. Now you can say maybe that the philosopher is the one who helps bring forth what really is, as opposed to what is not, because the naive realist, which is what we all for the most part are, is that everything just is. This is a pen, this is a book, I am, but the philosopher has to deliver, what does it have? Help birth being. But then there's this passage at 496d, which where a philosopher, it's described that a philosopher can also just depart from this world when he knows that he's free from the injustices or the inappropriateness of the world and the unholy works of this life that it can bring. But there should actually be a place, Socrates continues, where the philosopher can be someone who not just safeguards his own soul, but actually safeguards and saves and protects and harbors the community.
Yeah, so the quote goes, thus, like someone who takes refuge under a little wall from a storm of dust or hail driven by the wind, the philosopher, seeing others filled with lawlessness, is satisfied if he can somehow lead his present life free from injustice and impious acts, and depart from it with good hope, blameless and content.
And you mentioned the divine before, the divine part. It's here that at 500e, Plato writes that those who can really, none of the state forms that we're aware of are actually philosophical. But there is, and that's why those who have access to theoparadigmati, so paradigm is still a word we use. Paradigmati means, in German, it's Urbild. So that's something like a primordial image. That's a divine primordial image. Philosophers to Plato have memory of this. He says this also in, I think, in the Phaedrus as well, that the philosopher is the one who does have, in the Phaedrus, and also in, I think in the Cretius, I'm not quite sure, but I think in the Phaedrus definitely, where it is about memory, and the soul of the philosopher. The soul of the philosopher always, for Plato, has access to the divine. And this is here now, a couple pages later, the idea of the good, he tu akathu idea, the idea of the good, is introduced as megiston mathema, which is translated by Schleiermacher as höchste Erkenntnis, which would be highest knowledge or highest recognition or cognition. So the idea of the good is simply introduced, and now of course the question is, how do you, we translate idea as idea, idee, and we just go over it. But idea used to mean, weirdly enough, the way in which something appears to the eye. Mm-hmm. And then Plato turns it into something no longer of the eye really, but something that still appears as good in itself to reason. And hence the analogy of the sun is introduced here. And so the many, he says, they don't. The many don't. They say the hoi polloi are not. They see the good too readily, too easily, and they conflate it with lust and their desires, with what serves them and what satisfies their desires. Right? That's what the hoi polloi assume to be good, but that's not phronesis.
Yeah, and this is something that Aristotle will pick up on at the start of the Nicomachean Ethics. He'll say, in his very Aristotelian way, surveying all the society, he'll say, what do people call the good? And he'll say, oh, the lower classes call good food and good wine the good. And then he'll look at the warriors and say, oh, they call victory in battle good. But then he'll say, what is the good that what's a good that has no further link in the chain?
Yeah.
And this is why, he'll say wisdom.
So Aristotle begins the Ethics with the same question. Do you want to say more on Aristotle just now, as it's written anyways?
No, particularly. There's just, they both treat these things in such different ways. I mean, but it's a nice. You can do a little side thing, but just as a way to illustrate the different methods that they have. Plato, you talked about dialectic, the good and the bad of dialectic, but for Plato, the way that he reaches the conclusions he does, it's very important for him that he doesn't do it through doxa, as we've been saying, through looking at society as a whole. But whereas for Aristotle, it is important. Aristotle is a kind of scientist of society, of culture, and so he'll look at. He thinks it's very important, and that what various people think has weight, and he goes. Let us try and find a rationalization or a rationale for these beliefs. So he doesn't want to dismiss them just because people who are not philosophers believe them. He says he thinks people do things for a reason, and so he's always looking to affirm, to find the reason in people's beliefs and inclinations. Whereas Plato has this much more severe idea of and method of arriving at truths that he does, and the idea that, as you say, the hoi polloi would have any kind of bearing on that is anathema to him.
And and this is why Plato here introduces phylax, in German that's Hüter, the guardian. I suppose it would be in English at 506b if listeners want to read along. And that's the one who knows the good, the idea of the good, and hence can properly guide and lead the polis, which leads on to the Sonnengleichnis. Depending on the English translation, it might be analogy of the sun, it might be allegory in your text.
Analogy.
Analogy.
Yeah.
Which is good, I think, because that's actually the word used in Greek is analogy. It speaks in an analog way. Do you want to say something on analogy? Aristotle is huge on it, if not.
No, I don't think. I mean, Aristotle is interested in particular, as I've just said. He's very interested in examples.
Yeah.
He's contra to Plato, he is a philosopher of particularity, whereas Plato is the philosopher of anti-particularity. He's the philosopher of abstracting away from particularity, ascending the ladder towards, as we've been saying, the truth, what is. So I find that interesting, just from the way they write. As I said, I think it's really useful to think of Aristotle as a scientist. Remember, he started as a biologist, looking at sea animals and how does this animal reproduce? How does this animal walk? And it's only later that only a portion of Aristotle's writings is actually what we would call philosophy. He's very much empirical in that sense, whereas, as we say, Plato, the empirical data is by its nature untrustworthy. Oh, yeah. We always need to try and move above that.
Yeah, just briefly, Pierre Hadot, in his book Philosophy, it's translated in English as Philosophy as a Way of Life. He mentions that very often Aristotle is confusing to scholars today because he's contradicting himself, even within the same text, several times over. But he also points out that that's because these are lectures that Aristotle presented, and very often these lectures were given from, I wouldn't say, many different perspectives, that sounds a bit too modern, but different methodoi, which means different paths towards that what he's trying to say. So he's not writing a system philosophy in the sense that we know, that we understand philosophy in the modern era. So I don't think it would be fair to say there's a Plato's system or Aristotle's system, because there is not a system. There are just ways of trying to understand the world and to carve out maybe what really is ultimately. That's one of Aristotle's questions, is ti to on, what are beings, or what is being, depending on how you translate it. Just as a side note, it's very interesting how Aristotle is translated. When you read a bit of the Greek and what we now call the metaphysics, even just the title is
confusing. Because it just means the book after physics. That's what it means.
Metaphysica. That was invented by a librarian in Alexandria, I think.
Yeah.
And Aristotle, in this book, we translate Aristotle as having, you speak of the four causes. He does not really, I think, speak of four causes in such a systematic way. For example, one of the one of the causes is sometimes translated as formal cause. In Greek says to ti en enai, which Paul Natorp translates as that which was being. And very often what we translate in English as essence is also to ti en enai, that which was. So it's very interesting, just as an aside, that there's temporality introduced by Aristotle into this way of thinking. Is that which was, is that which is. But here now we're moving on to the analogy of the sun, and it's exactly because hoi polloi do see many separate things, but what's unifying all of this, that's what's lacking. We need to get to a unifying whole. Without the unifying, Heidegger would put it, the all-unifying one, we are trapped. The world is basically in chaos. And
in shadow, you might say.
Yes.
And it's we have the sun here, and then obviously the cave, and it's really interesting how Plato keeps coming back to this sight and seeing as a really good as an analogy to being and not being, and knowledge and belief.
Yes.
This is really important to him, and just as a way of showing how flawed the senses are, how we can be so certain of things that we see, but which on further reflection, on when knowledge is brought to bear on them, that even things which seem so clear before our eyes are flawed and mixed and messed up and not stable and truthful.
So the dialogue that arrives at seeing as the sense which is closest to the sun, which is the most similar to the sun, and that actually is also said in the Greek. The word is a very long Greek word. It's helioe destaton. So helios is the sun, and then you have eidos. So that's picture. Actually, that's image. Eidos sometimes also form, depending on your translation, and it comes closest then to the sun. That's the Greek. Amongst all the tools of perception, that's the Greek, and in Greek it says aesthesis. That's where you get the word aesthetics from. Aesthesis organon, organics, or organs, and organon is tools in Greek. So they do speak of the tools of what we would call perception, of taking in, of seeing. Seeing is the one that's closest to the sun. That sense is a dynamis. We get the word dynamics from. Vermögen, capacity or faculty. And then here the word at 508b, analogon, analogy, is introduced insofar as the good and the sun. The good has introduced or generated the sun in similarity with itself. And thinking, or that which can be thought, is analogous. That which can be thought is analogous to that which, to thinking, is just as that which can be seen is analogous to, or is related. There's an analogy between that which can be thought and thinking to that which can be seen and seeing. Seeing needs, unlike hearing does not need the sun. I should have said this before. But seeing needs the light of the sun. And so does seeing or thinking require the idea of the good. It needs to be guided by something external to it.
Yeah, the concept is, you can call it the concept of dependence, right? Seeing that seeing, the power of seeing, is not independent. It's not sufficient unto itself. It is dependent on this greater thing, the sun, and light.
Yeah.
And in the same way, the things that we see, the particulars that participate, are dependent on this greater thing.
Yeah.
They participate in something bigger.
Yes. And as much as the 500 AD, he says the same thing again, eyes are blind at night, and it's only thanks to the sun that the eyes can see, to the light of the sun. But of course, thinkers like us who live, who have to exist after the Renaissance, there's always an interplay of shadow here, even here, that we maybe get into later on. But so even here, though, is mentioned that at night the eyes are blind, but then they need the sun. So you have the movement, or the change from the darkness of the night to the light of the day. And this is what the soul requires also. So this, to me, you could read perhaps as developmental. The soul needs the development towards being able to be guided by the idea of the good and recognizing it in order to achieve the highest cognition of that which is to on. And only then does it arrive fully at nous, which is here translated by Schleiermacher as reason, Vernunft. Which, by the way, the German word Vernunft is very far removed from reason in English, or rationality. Rationality is very much connected to ratio, which has to do with calculating. But Vernunft comes from vernehmen, which means to perceive, which is then again closer to aesthetic or aesthesis, to perceiving that which is. So it's reason that actually does see that which truly is Vernunft in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was. I made this what seemed like an odd analogy to a blueprint of a building to the building itself.
Yeah.
In the last podcast, and I didn't explain it very well, but this is what I was getting at, right? The reason can see the building, i.e., a blueprint of it, i.e., its angles. You can work this out mathematically through reason, through the building, better than the eye can actually see the building in life. Yeah. So this is what I was getting at.
Yes,
a blueprint being a rational picture. We're using angles and we're using mathematics. We're working out dimensions, so we're kind of seeing it. You can call a blueprint like a rational, a mathematical picture of the building, in which you don't get just from looking at it in life.
But I would say it's not only mathematical. You see, but why I say this? Because because the danger of the model. I mean, you could almost say that the idea is a blueprint, for the model, and the world we live in is driven by models and modeling, and those are very often not anymore even representations of the world, but are mathematical imagings of the world then nature must adhere to again. Mm-hmm. So yes, there is a blueprint, but an architect does not just have to be able to see the blueprint. He has to be able, right? An architect, they have to be able to, in order to build a house that stands for significant time and is able to. The house is then a dwelling ground for human beings. But if it's purely mathematical or purely rationalistic, then it's no longer maybe a dwelling ground, to speak with Heidegger, of mortals, but it becomes something a bit more dangerous. It becomes housing instead of a house. It doesn't become a home, to speak in these a bit too
German ways.
Well, yeah, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
If it's purely rationalistic, then it's not. Then we're not building houses. Then what we're building is we're constructing entities that resemble a house because they have all the mathematical features or geometrical features of what a house should have, but they're never inviting as a place where people can actually live and die. They're simply, as whatever buildings look like now. Precisely because here the model has taken over, and it's the physics of what a house is no longer, that's what I mean. The idea of which, or the form, if you like, of which Plato speaks is not a model in that sense. It is and it isn't. And then maybe that's where it gets tricky, and I couldn't work it out just in dialogue perhaps, but that's where it gets tricky, because to some degree, yes, it is a model. But not only that, because the other questions go in as well, which is something that we have now forgotten, which is to ask, but what is a house?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the physis of a house? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Not just
what is the ergon?
The ergon.
Yes.
So the analogy of the sun leads on to the Liniengleichnis, the analogy of the line. And it leads on to this. Why? In order to separate that which can only be that which can be seen by the eye and that which cannot be seen by the eye, and to make that distinction clear.
Yeah, and it's also, what it's doing is, it's just as there are different, we're talking about different kind of categories of being, but what Plato wants to say is that just as there are different categories of being, there are different mental kind of degrees of, not degrees, but ways of knowing the various things. So we've talked about things that are and are not, so things that we see with the senses, and knowledge, or the way we, the mental faculty we're using to apprehend those, though this category of being is different to the mental activity, mental capacity we're using to comprehend something of a higher order of being and a lower order of being. So the four parts of the line, or the four capacity, I call them kind of capacities, are at the bottom you have imagination, above that you have belief, above that a bit higher you have thought, and then at the very top you have understanding. And as we've talked about in the earlier part of book 6, the philosopher is the person who has understanding, and you can only have understanding over things which are, not which things which are and are not, things that are perceptible, but the unchanging forms, as he'll later say. So just as there are, Plato has this throughout this book, is constructing these little. This is more than an analogy, but this is a connection. So remember how Plato found that there were three kinds of people in society as a whole, and he mapped those onto the three parts of the soul. And here he's saying that there are four categories of being, and he's mapping these onto four capacities of understanding in the mind.
And there's something very important, and we might disagree on that or not, but one of the words that's being used quite often in the analogy of the line is Hypothesis. And that means in German Voraussetzung. In English it means hypothesis. It is that which is presupposed. And so it's quite fascinating to see this, because if you think of the science of logic by Hegel, the science of logic by Hegel is the first and only work in philosophy so far, which begins entirely without presupposition and arrives without presupposition at the categories. And this is after Kant, who came to see and to critique. The critique is the critique is a critique of the presupposition that thought makes, which is the identity between being and thought. But Plato already sees this to some degree. He sees that there is, on the lowest levels, but also on the higher levels, interestingly, there's always hypothesis. There's always a Voraussetzung, a presupposition that's made. So the soul, as he says here, makes use of, this is at 510b, makes use of hypothesis, of presuppositions. And, for example, and then we're back to the question and the trouble of, so it's not, this is why it's so nefarious to start believing that Plato just assumes that there is the world of forms and the world of appearances. That makes it very neat, and that's actually, to speak with Hegel, that's the understanding. That's representation talking that wants to corroborate and hold on to something. Speculative reason, let's go. But here, Plato says, for example, nachgeahmtes, yeah, mimesis, so that which is just a mimicry, like images, for example, those can be used by the soul as an hypothesis. So even in the mathematical, in mathematics and in geometry, there's something that begins from a hypothesis, but it never gets actually behind its own hypothesis. So Plato already sees that the soul does, and this is why he says, he mentions calculation, measuring, schemata, geometry. Those are exact, yes, but they make available doxa, he says. For what? In order to engage with the world. But if you stop there, then you are just on the purely mathematical, calculative level, and you're not going, as he says, without going back to arche, origin. So there's never a going back to origin. And that's only possible through dialectics, which he says. Plato says explicitly, 511a, he stresses again that the soul in this way is forced to make or to posit a presupposition and then prove it. Right? The strange thing about the so-called natural sciences, or the hard sciences as they're now called, is that they continuously posit hypotheses which at the same time become their ground. Hypo means under, below, basic, and then they prove this thesis on which they stand as their own ground. Plato sees all of that already and says that's necessary for the soul to be in the world, but at the same time the soul must recognize that it's here copying, imitating, and using images, and that means only certain aspects of, say, nature, but never its wholeness, because it doesn't. But wholeness does not mean empirically to add everything up, right? But to begin with the one, enache, to begin with hen panta enai, that one is many, as Heraclitus says. That's where thinking has to begin, perhaps. But here he says the soul must then logos itself, actually, he says at 511b, must be able to think back behind its presuppositions, and that happens only through the ideas. And I say it again, Hegel's logic begins with pure being, which shows itself to be nothing, and then moves on through becoming and through essence, and by the way, through measuring and quantity, etc., to the full idea of being, and thereby reining in all presuppositions. So someone like Hegel does not accept the principle of non-contradiction. But why? Because if you assume that as an hypothesis, then you end up like Kant, who runs into the antinomies of reason. For example, one of the most prominent examples is the world is eternal. It has no beginning. It has no end. And on the other side, in the critique, it says there is a clear starting point. There will be a clear end point. That's an antinomy of reason, and reason can make perfect sense of both of them. And he runs into those precisely because he presupposed the principle of non-contradiction. So we're seeing this connection here, just to point this out, between what's now called German idealism and Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle is struggling with these same questions, so is Plato, and this is why Plato is always going back and forth. He sees that what's becoming necessary is dialectics. He says it's only dialectics that can go back to acher, to that which to the origin, and then to being itself, and not starting from an unfounded image. But at the same time, as we'll see later on at the end of Book 7, he says that also dialectics is dangerous, precisely because it brings in non-being with being. Because if you get into dialectics, then you have to accept that being to some degree is nothing. But yeah, so that's my 2 cents on the analogy of the line.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. Just the way that Plato is already grappling with things like philosophy of science, like the problems and uses of dialectic,
and images and shadows.
Yeah,
and shadows especially. But he's not. This is what Heidegger will then be the one who says no, but what you forget is concealment. You forget the shadows. You're dealing with them. You're addressing them. But you're not. You're pushing them aside. So yeah, would you like to add some more on this? Because my base desires are calling for me to open another bottle of water.
No, you do it.
Speaking of Aristotle.
Yeah. I mean, I haven't read Hegel and Heidegger as much as you do.
Yeah.
But it's with the line.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been talking a lot about ascending from what appears to be to
yes.
what is,
exactly.
and the line provides like a nice image to because it's not a horizontal line, it's a vertical line.
Yeah.
That's quite important for Plato, and he'll return again and again to this idea of ascending from, and this is why he has the sun as an analogy for the good. So it's something above us. Okay, we're going from, and this just shows, and go back to that famous painting, the School of Athens.
Yes.
And this just to echo what I've been saying about the difference between Aristotle and Plato. It's such a widely known image, but it's such a useful one as well for understanding. Aristotle is pointing down to the ground, saying, look at all this stuff around us as the scientists, as the empiricists. Let's look and study everything that we see around. And yet Plato is saying to him, no, look up, look to the sky, ascend the levels of being, ascend the capacities of knowledge from mere imagination, belief, up to thought and understanding at the very top. So the line is such a good one, and leads to the cave in book 7.
Leads down into the cave.
Back down. Yeah, again,
Yeah.
So that's what we'll end up with in the cave is it's both. The cave is beautiful because it's both a philosophical, epistemological theory. What he's doing is joining this. What is the line is and the sun analogy are both kind of epistemological theories about knowledge and its connection to being, what it can grasp, and yet he's joining it with a political theory. I mean, which is the two kind of concerns of this book, right? We have the various political theories. I mean, we've said how they're not really the center of this book, and various writers have played around with how ironic Plato is being in the theories that he comes up with when he's drawing this state. Is he being playful? Is he being ironic? But there's a clear political aspect to this book, obviously, joined to this, what is a study of knowledge and being, and the cave just beautifully meshes those two together. We have a theory of what knowledge is, but then joined to it is a theory of what the philosopher is and what the duty of the philosopher is, which is to come back down from this contemplation of the forms and of the good down to the people and to educate them and lead them.
Maybe just briefly on, as you mentioned, the Raphaelus School of Athens. And Plato points upwards and Aristotle towards the earth. That's not to say that one of them is wrong, one of them is right, depending which side you pick or which tastes you have. It's actually in this image, and of course this is of the Renaissance period. It's both. To speak with, and the ascending does not mean to leave behind. It's very important to point out that the line, even when the line crosses over into thought, which is no longer maybe, as we would say, sensual. It's not a caesura. It's not interrupted. The line is the same line. It remains the same line. There's not a pure, just pure reason.
Which goes back to what we were saying about there's not being two separate realms of being and non-being, of the forms and of reality. It's all connected. It's we ascend it. It's all the same line.
And actually, when you
see you see the general through the particular. Right? There's no other way to it. You can't get to the abstract truth without the general.
And when you were speaking about ascending, that's purely by association, so that's not really profound, but it reminded me to some degree of the Hegelian, very important Hegelian notion of aufheben, which usually is translated as sublating, which does have, I think, in English, to the English ear, does have the ring of really, picking something up to the next level. But aufheben can also mean to protect, to harbor, to pick up, but also to cancel out. And the process of aufheben in the dialectics in Hegel is always all of those combined. So the category of becoming, which is pure becoming, shows itself to be completely empty and would collapse back into just being and nothing, going back and forth, if it didn't become something. It needs to become something, and then something, in order for the logic to progress, it needs to be finite. It needs to be for itself, but also for something other. There needs to be something else and not the other, not just something, because if not, then it would fall back into pure becoming and so on. So, and there's always a collapse into the next, but it's a remembering. There's memory, and at the same time a forgetting. And I think the cave tells the story, because if the cave just said, well, look, here's here's the world of shadows, which is wrong, it's all fake, leave it behind, then no one would return into the cave. But actually there is a return into the cave, and there's a necessary return into the cave. And it will actually get to a point where he does say, which is a bit later in book 7, which is already after, when the analogy is already ended, basically, he does mention that it's necessary for the philosopher to be able to understand shadows, because shadows will always make up our world. There is no world without shadows. So Plato is not saying, decisively not saying, there is this perfect world of forms which we need to get to, and this is all just ephemeral and nothing. Now this world is, to speak in ontological terms, this world is structured by shadows. It's made up of shadows, and that's what's so dangerous. And let's just give a very concrete examples. We believe pictures, very readily so. We believe pictures. All the talk about deep fakes now is just the next level of the shadows in the cave. And very importantly, this begins with paideia, which is usually translated, I think in your text it's education.
Yeah.
In German, of course, it's Bildung. This is the 19th century, so we speak of Bildung, which means formation according to an image. Really, it means, Bildung means image. You remember when we had the conference on Humboldt, that's one of the things that we talked about. So there's a physin paideia. So that means that the physis, again, of the human being is supposed to be raised into its own. And it's being to be led into its essence. Again, that's very important. So the scholastic essentialism just says, this is just this essence, and that's got this essence. No, we need to be led into there needs to be a letting into the proper essence, or physis, or self-rising and arising. And so it's almost like, it's not like, I'm not talking about liberation or anything, but I'm talking about a leading
formation.
Yes.
Just to interrupt and to remind us, or to go back to the last part 1 of the podcast. Remember we talked about, we'll get back to this in a bit, just what Plato's thoughts about poetry and drama are. But remember, after what seems like a rank dismissal of poetry because of the content of it, it's important that we remember how important poetry is for the education, for the formation of people who are not philosophers. So these stories are important for the formation of those people. This was in one of the earlier books. So
book 3. I think.
Yeah, of course. Bowdlerized, to use a term, or edited with all the problematic parts about God's acting in two ways at once and kind of playing around with humans for their sport. But poetry properly construed and with the right content is important for education, for formation. And what does poetry deal in? Appearances, shadows.
Yeah. So I actually noted this down at the beginning of book 10, which we'll get to. There's a reference back to book 3. So anyone who wants to read up on this is 392c to 394c. There, Plato makes a distinction between mimetic art, mimetike, which is replication, reproduction in this technical sense of mimetics, and narration, Erzählung in German, which is diegesis in Greek. And mimetics is the problem, because the mimetician, as he calls them, the mimetician is by a third degree removed from aletheia, from what we translate as truth, from unconcealment, from disclosedness, as Heidegger would translate. And but maybe just briefly on the cave, what it looks like. and you can jump in whenever you like. People are in chains at their neck and knuckles, is it?
Yeah, I can just read this if you like.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is a very start of book 7. Socrates says, compare the effect of education and the lack of it on our nature to an experience like this. Imagine human beings living in an underground cave-like dwelling with an entrance a long way up, which is both open to the light and as wide as the cave itself. They've been there since childhood, fixed in the same place, with their necks and legs fettered, able to see only in front of them because their bonds prevent them from turning their heads around. Light is provided by a fire burning far above and behind them. Also behind them, but on higher ground, there is a path stretching between them and the fire. Imagine that along this path a low wall has been built, like the screen in front of puppeteers above which they show their puppets. Then also imagine that there are people along the wall carrying all kinds of artifacts that project above it, statues of people and other animals made out of stone, wood and every material. And as you'd expect, some of the carriers are talking and some are silent. So it's almost a puppet theatre.
Yes, it's very much described similar to a theatre, a puppet theatre as you call it.
Except the audience are somewhat constrained. They are forced to be here, and this is all they've seen. Imagine imagine an audience born in a puppet theatre. Kind of.
And that's an echo.
And it's all they've known.
There's an echo. Echo in Greek. It's the same word in English and in German. Echo. Echo, they would say, I think. So
the point that Socrates comes to, do you suppose, first of all, that these prisoners see anything of themselves and of one another behind the shadows that the fire casts in front of the wall on them? Well, how could they? Socrates Interlocutor says, if they have to keep their heads motionless throughout life. What about the things being carried along the wall? Isn't the same true of them? Of course. And if they could talk to one another, don't you think they suppose that the names they used applied to the things they see passing before them? Well, they'd have to. And what if their prison also had an echo, as Johannes said, from the wall facing them? Don't you think they'd believe that the shadows passing in front of them were talking whenever one of the carriers passing along the wall was doing so? So they just naturally associate these phenomena.
I made a film last year with a friend of mine, Patricio Alvarez from Chile. He's back in Chile now, in London, where we filmed. So he filmed, I was with him. Places around Piccadilly Circus, lots of screens. We only filmed screens and people staring at screens, sometimes 3, 4, 5 screens at once. And then I read the analogy of the cave over it, just to give perhaps a hint at what is meant with shadows and images. Eidolon. So that's the neat form of eidos, of what we translate as form. That's what's making up the cave, is eidolon, is little images, little forms. Not even, there are still, and so it's not about that. It's not to say that none of this is real. It is, in a strange sense, actual, but it is not fully actual. They are already moving in, as Heidegger would say, an as structure, where they are disclosing the world as their world, obviously. Which is why when it's described that when someone is freed, it happens under pain. This is again, it's not described as an awakening to reason, right? Some rationalistic model by which we control and access the world properly once and for all. No, to speak with Heidegger, the happening or the taking place of unconcealment is described by Plato as painful. And the light of the torches hurts the one who's been freed. And Plato actually says that the question ti estin, what is, ti estin, what is the one question that will guide the one who's been freed on his way upwards. And that's necessarily so. So he uses the word ananke in Greek. Necessarily so. And also that there is a need to respond to that question. So as he walks up, he begins to ask, what is? And that's the beginning of philosophy. That's when there's already... there's a difference that's occurred. A difference between that which seemed to be and that which now could be, or is more appropriately. And interestingly, the word that's used is, in German it's translated as verwirrt, which means confused, but the Greek is here aporein, which of course reminds us of aporia. And aporein means confused, which means roadless. He's pathless, he's without path. That's what aporia means. But this is, of course, there's much talk about aporia now and how it's such a wonderful thing. But the early dialogues of Plato, yes, they always end in aporia. Some of them end in aporias. But that's not where Plato or Socrates stop. That's mere confusion. You need to get over aporia. Aporia is that confusion perhaps is necessary because one could believe that the shadows down there could have been truthful, could have been real, genuine. But again, it's through necessitation, distress, an emergency, pain, that the one who's freed steps out into the light and, of course, is even more confused and moves towards aletho, that which is fully disclosed. And the world, however, when it's disclosed to him outside the cave, is not fully visible because the light is too bright.
And because they've been there since birth, which is why he set this up in this way. Like they're so accustomed to the shadows. It's not like they're sometimes out in the light and sometimes in the cave. He's very careful to set this up since they've been there since childhood, is what he says, since birth. So clearly this is going to be something that's, as we say, confusing and painful, and all those things, given what they've grown up with.
And then what's necessary is that he gets accustomed to the what he sees, even after having spent the night. So he needs to spend the night first, and only then can he begin to see, but only at first shadows, and then shadows of other humans and animals, as is described, as they are mirrored in the water. So he sees eidola, again images, little forms, and he can only look at the sky by night at first, and the sun only later on, after having spent the night. So we see again this movement through darkness into light, but we also we have to recognize, because if you, just to say the obvious, you stare at the sun too long, you become blind. There's a darkness again, and actually you begin to see shadows where there aren't any. So there's something with, to speak in Hegelian terms, with positivity that can have, if it's all too positive, its own negativity, that can bring about its own negativity. However, what's then described is that the one who's outside will gather, syllogizoito, will bring together, and the English can still say gather to understand, right? So I gather that this is what you mean. So he gathers, he understands, he gets to know that it's the sun which grants horas, hours, times, seasons, and that by that, interestingly, so it's interesting, I think it's very important to point out that time is mentioned here explicitly, that it's time and seasons which order in a certain way that which is. So the ordering takes place in and through time. Again, he's not left some cosmos and went into some other cosmos. He's still in the same realm. It's a different region of that area, we could perhaps say, but it's still in the same. And he will, of course, as Plato says, he will feel happy, content with the metabole, with the change, and he will feel pity or compassion, depending on your translation, with his fellow human beings down in the cave, which is why he ultimately moves back down, only to be faced with death.
Yeah, and it's just in 516d he talks about so if there were any honours, praises or prizes among them for the one who was sharpest at identifying the shadows as they passed by, who best remembered, which usually came earlier, which later, which simultaneously, and who could thus best divine the future. Do you think that our man would desire these rewards or envy those among the prisoners who were honoured and held power? Indeed, wouldn't he feel with Homer that he'd much prefer to work the earth as a serf to another, one without possessions, and go through any sufferings rather than share their opinions and live as they do? So again, this is the difference between Plato and Aristotle. Just Plato, complete contempt for the cares and honours of ordinary people. It has really no consideration whatsoever. This is all just the kind of the temptings of mistaken people, and so our philosopher really has, being a person that is much higher cares, he was interested in grasping being and truth and things higher up that line that we talked about, is less concerned with the honours and prizes of those below.
Well, on some level, if you want to read it through that kind of socio-economic perhaps, or social lens, but I think what he's saying also is that what he says is that what the world is made up of, to a large degree, and the philosopher has to understand this. And this is why the philosopher does not actually want power, is precisely because the philosopher understands what mostly makes up the world are shadows. Not everything that appears to be is. So what I'm trying to say is this. It might seem like contempt, but on the other hand, it's actually a warning to the philosopher not to fall for the shadow world, which never can be left behind. We will never be able to leave the cave. In order to become free, one has to return into the cave and step deeper into the cave, sit in the midst of these games that are played for the rewards and awards of remembering the shadows correctly, not taking those games too seriously, at the same time appreciating that it is shadows on which makes up the world to a certain degree. And hence the philosopher is the proper ruler, because it doesn't fall for the power games and other rewards such as those, but actually always continues to look for that which truly is, which there can be. T.S. Tin, that's the question. What is? So yeah, that would be just my reading.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to work out what exactly Plato meant by sharpest at identifying the shadows as they pass by, and he best remembered which usually came earlier, which later. I was trying to think what the exact analogy is, and I was thinking like, I've written astronomy, maybe, history, maybe. We all know that one of the pastimes of people in this 3rd, 4th century BC was astronomy, was guessing when say eclipses would happen. That was thought very wise. the history. So what's coming, what came earlier, which later, which simultaneously, and divining the future. So Thales, one of the first philosophers, was thought one of the wisest people because he did predict this eclipse. But Plato. I've called it contempt, but certainly Plato's talking about a totally different degree of concern, and we just have to quote. He quotes Homer. He'd much rather to work the earth as a serf to another, one without possessions, and go through any suffering rather than share their opinions and live as they do. So this is something that's unbearable to the philosopher. He just cannot. And the reason is, I think because it is essentially not living in error, but living merely with beliefs and opinions and thoughts, is just to live on this lower level of understanding.
Confusion.
Yeah.
It is, isn't it? That's how he describes it at some point later on in Book 10. That doxai representations. Or vague ideas, maybe that's how we can understand it. But not ideas in the Platonic sense, obviously, but how we would understand it, the English vernacular now. Ideas, vague ideas, and that are completely contradictory. That they don't form a whole.
Yeah, and we talked a bit before about why the philosopher is so ridiculed. In Book 6, why, considering that the philosopher is the best person to lead a state, why is he so ridiculed? And Plato has a kind of second answer here, which is that once you've been and seen the sun, if you went back down to the cave and tried to compete with the people who are used to shadows, you'd be quite bad at it, wouldn't you? He says. If he had to compete again with the perpetual prisoners in recognising the shadows, wouldn't he invite ridicule? Wouldn't it be said of him that he'd returned from his upward journey with his eyesight ruined, and it isn't worthwhile even to try to travel upward? So he's saying, this is why philosophers are ridiculed, because they're so useless in the day-to-day kind of jostlings and competitions of ordinary.
Yeah, okay, maybe with that, but not with what really matters in the everyday.
No, of course. This is his way of saying what really matters.
And importantly, he says the philosopher, the one who returns, is faced with death. They will want to kill him. That's at 517a. They would rather kill him than follow him upwards outside.
Yeah. Well, as for anyone who tried to free them and lead them upward, if they could somehow get their hands on him, wouldn't they kill him?
Yes, exactly.
They certainly would.
By the way, Schelling...
As they killed Socrates. He's saying... Yeah.
Exactly. As they killed Socrates, but also, as it always comes back, with Schelling, for example, it clearly says philosophy begins when you have died. And not, physically, biologically, but when you have given up on these, weirdly enough, these shadows place, but
died to the world.
Yeah. And if you want to say more, just no, okay, because it sounded like it. But 520c, I said this before. 520c. If people want, listeners want to read up on this, this is where already before Socrates, in the text, changes into a plural. So the you that you read in the English will be a plural. You he addresses. You in general, all of you who want to be philosophers. And he says here, you all must, he says, you must now again step into the cave. Each or every one of you according to where you belong, blah, blah, blah. And you must move down to the dwelling ground, to the Wohnung of the rest. And you must get accustomed with them. Das Dunkle zu schauen, to see the dark. That's in Greek, that's kai synethistion, ta skotena, that's shadows, theasastai. That's again, theasastai is, that's where you get theoria. Theasastai means to gaze at, to look at. So, syn e thistion ta skotena theastastai. That means to get used again to seeing the dark. And if you do so, he says, if you get accustomed to this again, then you will be 1,000 times better as those down here, down there, 1,000 times better able to see than them, and to recognize each Schattenbild in German, each eidola, again in Greek, each image of a shadow, a shadowy image. What's the English here? According to what it is and of what it is.
Image, yeah.
Image, okay, but Schleiermacher is very strong here that he brings in shadow, so a shadowy image, sorry. According to what it is and of what it is, because you have seen the beautiful, to kalon, tekai dikaion, which is the just, or as we translated last time, the appropriate, and even in its truth, itself in its truth, kai akathon, and the good, itself. So what happens here is that there's a call by Socrates, or Plato, shall we say, that to move back into the cave. And the way I read this is that he actually speaks of dreaming, you're no longer dreaming. And in this way you will be able to organize, to run and govern the state in an awake sense without fighting these shadowy battles. I'm still reading the text. So it's actually, and I read this as saying, by leading through shadows. So it's through understanding shadows that philosophers lead. And it's very interesting when you think of Giordano Bruno, the Renaissance thinker, that he has this book on the shadows of ideas, that memory works actually by appreciating shadows, the grayscale between light and dark. That's how memory works. That's how you best memorize something. And those who memorize the best, remember the best, they have the power, which is why perhaps some corporations are rather data hungry, because they are empirical memories of what people do and where people are and what people think and what people say. Maybe that's just a hint. Mm-hmm. Maybe we leave it at that. But so we see that where we can see why it's so important. To read the cave now. This is. I'll say something I haven't said publicly yet. I wanted to go to the Gymnasium by St. Stephan, the humanistic gymnasium I went to as a kid, because I wanted to read Latin and Greek to understand the mysteries of the world. That was what I thought when I was 10 years old. And it took me years and years and years, because it was incredibly boring, until finally I had a very good teacher called Matthias Färber. And with him, I think we read that part of the Republic. And that's when it hit me. That's when philosophy began for me properly. I was 16, maybe 17, maybe, I don't know, 18, I don't know. This is the cave. It's all in the cave. If we understand the cave, it hit me. It's the television. It's so obvious. It's the television, it's the internet, it's the iPhone. It's whatever screen we look at and believe and think that it makes up our world, and it does. And yeah, so
that's useful to.
But look at they mentioned the Scherbenspiel. I don't know, the 521c, this Greek game of charades that they played, where they would have to find light and darkness. I don't know actually about the game, but this is one of contingency. But in the soul, in the proper paideia, in the formation, in the Bildung, or the education of the soul, it's no longer contingent. But it always has to do with light and dark, and it's towards the light that the soul must move. And now, of course, we know that Heidegger would say, actually you forgot concealment here. And then, of course, what comes in, and we don't have to get into it, but I'll just mention it, is the question for to hen, das eine, the one, the all-unifying one. So that's
the form of the good.
Well, yeah, it's probably related, I would think, that it's the one that unifies all. That's another name for it, as you could say, I guess, yeah. And by the way, just to say this again, I said this a couple of times, what we now call German idealism basically begins thanks to Kant, when Schelling, Hölderlin and Hegel are roommates in Tübingen, and they read Heraclitus, hen panta einai, that one is many, and try to make sense of that sentence. And dialectics is here mentioned, 531d, as the highest art for the formation of the philosopher, because only dialectics sees and actually goes back to the origin itself, arche. And that's and actually he says here in Greek, tas hypothesis anairusa. And Schleiermacher translates this as sublating all presuppositions. So it goes back to the origin itself. It does not work just with models, just with blueprints, but goes back to arche, and that is always, the question then is, what is a house? And not just this is a blueprint of the house, with which we can build a house, if you see what I mean. Yeah.
Cool, so should we jump to book 10 to wind this up?
I'd like to say one more thing on the danger of dialectics also. 537e. Dialectics is introduced as the one way of thinking by which one can go back to arche. But there's this the child that's adopted, and when the child finds out that it's adopted, it will be open because it realizes its own non-being. It's non-being in the sense of not being of those who claim to be the child's parents. That's when it becomes open to those who want to tempt it and take it astray. So there's a danger by introducing non-being to being. And that's, by the way, something that the Catholics really hate about Hegel. Traditional Catholics is that he introduces non-being into being and into logos in that regard. But that's just, so maybe just briefly mention that there is a danger of dialectics that Plato is very much aware of. Book 10, Chris, your turn.
Yeah, so Plato's been playing all in various books of the Republic about poetry and drama, and we've talked in this part about the role that poetry can have, even if he thinks. So Plato thinks there are good things about poetry and bad things about poetry. One of the good things we said was in educational fora, where if we get the right kind of poetry that can help form some cohorts of our society to have the right ideas about the gods, and can help them in their activities in the Republic. But there are also bad things about poetry, not just, and we talked in book 3 about the content that is of poetry that makes it bad, i.e. in Homer there are parts where the gods are pesky and they play around with humans for sport and blowing Odysseus this way then one way, and the gods being both good and bad, which is contradictory in a way that Plato doesn't like. But here in Book 10, if that is a critique of the content of poetry, this is more a critique of the form of poetry. So it begins, Socrates saying, "Indeed, our city has many features that assure me we were entirely right in founding it as we did. And when I say this, I'm especially thinking of poetry. What about it in particular," Glaucon said, "that we didn't admit any that is imitative. Now that we have distinguished the separate parts of the soul, it's even clearer, I think, that such poetry should be altogether excluded." And Johannes, you want to say something about imitation and why it's this in particular that makes it bad.
Yeah, let me begin at the beginning. They start off at 595 C, asking the question, well, what is mimesis? What is replication, or what's the English used here in your translation? Do you know?
Imitative. So
Okay, yeah.
Imitation.
Imitation, sorry. Because then they say, there's many tables and there's many beds, but there's always just one idea, form, usually is translated. By the way, Schleiermacher, if you want to know, Schleiermacher translates idea as Begriff, which is concept, which of course now we all know from concept stores. By the carpenter makes a table by looking towards the idea. Look, it's very important. It's looking towards.
Again, sight as a...
Exactly. So seeing and sight, as Chris mentions, sight in the sense of not just, as we would say, with the sense organ, the eye, but also with nous. So there's a double seeing. There's a seeing towards and this is what Michelangelo, this is why the Renaissance is so important. Michelangelo said, "I saw the angel in the marble and I had to free it." So there is a seeing in a piece of timber, in a piece of marble, of something that's there. And there's a seeing towards something that is there, but that's not yet fully there. And it has to be brought forth. And this is how Heidegger translates poiesis, to bring forth. By the way, just to mention this briefly, my PhD supervisor, Miguel de Bistegui, has written published a book many years ago, I think 10, I'm not quite sure, 10 years ago maybe, which is entitled Aesthetics After Metaphysics, and the subtitle is From Mimesis to Metaphor. And Miguel argues that metaphor, metaphorein, means to bring forth, to show that which is literally there but hidden. And that Plato does not yet fully see this because he's trapped in the mimetic framework. But that Renaissance and especially so Proust is one of his examples, and Chilida and Heidegger in philosophy, that those are but not yet Plato. For Plato, it's about we're looking towards the idea, the concept or the form of the table, the carpenter that is, and by prosten idea and plepton, that's what this is, looking towards this, he can make a table. But he does not produce or bring forth the idea, the form itself. He's not the demiurge of the idea. There is a higher demiurge, God. However, what he does is he does bring forth a genuine table insofar as the table participates, met echeen, has participation in the idea properly. And it is then a table that can be used as a table. So the table is a table insofar as Chris and I can sit at his table in the kitchen, in his kitchen where we're having the microphone, we're having our books open, and we can sit here. This probably not what the table was made for, but we could also have dinner here, but it's a proper table. Still, it's to some degree not the table itself, insofar as not the idea, the idea, not the concept of the table, not the form of it. And so the imitating arts, for example, a painter who would now come and paint us sitting here, would be removed from aletheia, from truth, by a third degree. And that, to Plato, is just one step too much. Because it only shows a painting can always ever show one angle of the table. And it has no use, and it doesn't reveal anything that's true about it. By the way, this is where Heidegger absolutely and radically breaks with that tradition, because Heidegger says that it's actually in the painting that truth reveals itself. So, in the art, in a great work of art, in a great poem, for example, for Heidegger, the poem of the Rhine by Hölderlin is not a representation of the Rhine or trying to get close to what the Rhine is, but that's where the Rhine as a river occurs in its current history. And that's, so I'm just saying this now because there's always this struggle, and I would call it a struggle in Plato, to fight against that which is only seemingly real, that which only seems to be but is only imitative.
Yeah, and just to, did you mention Hölderlin? Schopenhauer as well will fight against, as we said last time, Schopenhauer's deeply influenced by Plato and by Kant, but where he thinks he can kind of fix the problem is that we can get to the essence, the general, the in itself through the particular, through. And art is so Schopenhauer is a big aesthetics, and he thinks that this is particularly true, and particularly true in music, which he thinks is the highest form of art. Music in particular, music is a piece of music is a particular piece of music. It has sometimes tones will move up and some tones will move down, but through that particular work, we can get to an essence, and in itself. A Platonic form or being, and tragedy as well is another. So Schopenhauer thinks the two great forms of art are music and tragedy, and through these we can break through to something higher. It's a route. So he's going to differ from Plato in this way, but as Johannes has been saying, the act of imitation that is essential to the form of poetry and tragedy reduces it, sends it down that divided line that we talked about before, and that's what lowers it in his eyes as something that has a function in the education of the masses, we could say, but not in the education of the philosopher, which is must only be concerned with what is, not things that are removed either once or twice.
Maybe we should here try and respond to that question that was on the channel, and while you're looking for that question, I would just very briefly point out that it's often mentioned that God in Plato is the Demiurge, which means tool, Handwerker in German, but the one who creates creates the world, creates the world as if it were his, as if in a workshop. But actually, at 597d, God is described as the Futurgon, and that means that's from physis. So it sounds like Demiurgon, but it's Futurgon, and that's to say the one who creates the physis of things, that which actually that which gives rise to the self-rising of nature. That's what God allows for, and that's why he is himself closest to physis, and that means to the self-growth and self-arising of things as they are. And here we can actually see, because I just mentioned Heidegger, just briefly, when you think of Heidegger's question concerning technology, Heidegger is here actually, I think, again, quite close to Plato, insofar as it's upon the human being now to allow for the physis of something to take its course in harmony. Whereas modern technology or techniques does the exact opposite, which is to challenge forth something from something without considering seasons, temporality, or the ownness of something, right? And hence also what technology or Gestell and framing positionality do is by enforcing something, it actually, what techniques begin, and framing begins, what Gestell begins to do is to imitate. Gestell can also turn into something gestellt, which means something artificial. It becomes something artificial. And that danger is something that Plato sees already. This is why he brings up Homer. Homer is not supposed to speak in the voice of Chrysippus, the priest, because he's not supposed to talk about waging war because he knows nothing about war. That's upon Agamemnon himself, or anyone who is in battle and knows about battle. By the way, just because we live in a very historiographical age, we've got history books about just about anything. Here's something. We don't have to get into this, but historein, of course, history of course is Greek. Historein means to be an eyewitness. So what we're pretending to do on this weird level is to be eyewitnesses of everything that was, without ever having been there. And this has to do with the Historienstreit in Germany in the 19th century was about this too, wie es eigentlich gewesen ist, how it really was. And Plato would say, no, we don't know how it really was. We were not there. We are not really eyewitnesses. But thanks to philosophy, we can always get to that realm where we have access to that which really is, insofar as it always pertains and always is true. And that's what we need to aspire to. That's what we properly learn, because then it's almost like self-explanatory. But so there is, and so what I'm trying to say about technology, the dangers of imitation and the replication and the world run by shadows is already, Plato sees this already.
Yeah, we're kind of what you're saying is it's easy to get attracted to that show. We're going back down the cave again. We're just the many, and the world of technology is excellent at reproducing what the puppetry of the cave.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah.
But just to sum up,
to sum it up, and then we do the question.
Plato's argument against poetry. So he says, this is at 600e. Then shall we conclude that all poetic imitators, beginning with Homer, imitate images of virtue, and all the other things they write about, and have no grasp of the truth. And again, you mentioned the way that Homer kind of deigns to speak of in voices that he has no expertise on, and this is what Socrates will say at 601. The poetic imitator uses words and phrases to paint coloured pictures of each of the crafts. He himself knows nothing about them, but he imitates them in such a way that others, as ignorant as he who judge by words, will think he speaks extremely well about the craft. So because he uses nice words and they're in a special meter and maybe they rhyme, an audience is lulled into believing what he says and believing that he has expertise in the things that he writes about, when really he's just very skilled at writing. But yeah, last week after the last podcast, Johannes posted on the YouTube video, invited listeners to post questions about the republics that we could, since we're doing this two-parter, we could kind of get to in the second part. And one of the comments was about mimesis and about the form of this book. I'm always encouraging listeners to study not just the content of the philosophy, but the form in which it's written. And the case is plain. As much as Socrates, Plato is arguing against mimesis and against drama, poetry, he writes in a very mimetic way. Okay, he tells the story of Socrates speaking in a cave. There are the characters. Thrasymachus is a very strong character. He describes the way that Thrasymachus jumps at them like an animal when he's trying to persuade them, when he gets very angry and annoyed at Socrates and trying to break down his argument and asserting his theory of what justice is. And all these, remember Cephalus, the old gent who talked about how good it is that he doesn't feel freed from sexual desire at a ripe old age and is able to contemplate better things. And compare, as I always say, compare Plato and Aristotle in this manner. Aristotle, by contrast, is, as I say, a scientific writer or a dry writer. And one of the things I was grappling with this very question, and when I was writing about this at university, why is Plato, who's so critical of mimesis and of particularity, write in such a sometimes florid and characterful and exciting way, and rooted in a particular situation way, whereas Aristotle, who is, by the opposite, is very insistent that the way we understand the world is through particularity. He's pointing at the ground in that painting. He's telling us, look around us, and yet he writes in this very scientific, lofty way. Let us count the 5 aspects of this and the 6 aspects of that, and the 7 kinds of that. So we have a complete opposite of what we imagine would be the case if the form and the content were lined up. So yeah, it's a great question, and the way I answer it is in purely contingent fashion. Okay, I don't think it's anything to do with the philosophical content of either. As I say, I think it's purely contingent on the character of the two philosophers. Okay, in Plato, we have a very political thinker. He came from a grand political family. All his family was involved in the running of Athens, and something we talked about in the first part of the podcast was Plato wants to achieve something with what he's writing, with his text, which is to get people involved in the practice of philosophy. And how does he do that? Well, he needs to. If he wants to do that, he has to draw people away from the pastimes of the day, which is poetry and tragedy. So he has to make it exciting, and he has to get people involved in this. He thinks it's a life and death struggle for the city. Whether if good people are to rule the city, then rulers need to become philosophers, or philosophers rulers. So he has a very contingent and particular reason for wanting to do this. Whereas, and by the same token, it's very contingent that Aristotle writes in this scientific way. As I said, he was a scientist. He went around measuring sea creatures and writing scientific tracts on everything under the sun. He was a polymath, avant la lettre. So it's purely, I think the best way to understand it, the simplest way to understand it, is that it's determined by the character of the two philosophers and for what they were trying to achieve. We talked yesterday, Johannes and I, that Plato kind of made the world safe for philosophy in a way for Aristotle. Okay, there wasn't such a person as there were philosophical thinkers like Heraclitus, like the pre-Socratics, but there wasn't a philosophical thinker of the magnitude of Plato before Plato. It just wasn't possible. So once Plato's great achievement was giving birth to full and established philosophy. He founded a school, of course, and in doing so, he made it possible for Aristotle to write what we now think of as much more conventional philosophical texts, of the kind that became the model for centuries and millennia to come. And I'm waffling now, so I'll let Aristotle take it.
I'll read the question. This is by Sprachgitter. So this person says the following. This is what you partially responded to at the beginning. Plato's criticism of poetry as mimesis is paradoxical, given the essentially mimetic structure of the Politeia itself. Surely, Plato could see this, which makes me wonder if the paradox is intentional. If so, what would this paradox be telling us about Plato's, in brackets concealed, unconcealed, point of view on poetry and philosophy? Would it be possible to explore this in the second part of the podcast? So, here we are. What I'd like to say first is a very good question, and it gets at something very important. But I'd like to hear more, perhaps. Maybe we'll invite. So what we could do, perhaps, we invite more people to leave more comments, more questions, and then if there are enough of those, we'll sit down at some point and just, without going line by line through the text, we'll just go. And we'll just do an episode on those comments. But on this now, and I've thought about this not enough yet, to be honest, and we'll have to do more. But I wonder what is meant by essentially mimetic structure. But that seems like, if it's mimetic, essentially, then it's like an imitation of a polis. But I don't think that's fair, because I'll say it again what we said before. What is it that Plato says the philosopher has access to? Is the following: to theo paradigmati, and that means the divine original image, a divine paradigm. That's what Plato, the philosopher, has access to. And to second what Chris has said, in this way, Plato makes room for the philosopher in the polis, and makes philosophy, paves the way for its necessity, and also shows why it's important. And so I don't think that the Politeia is essentially mimetic. I don't think that that's the case at all. There are, however, these moments where when they use images, and it's pointed out by one of the interlocutors of Socrates that it's ironic that Socrates would use an image now when he begins to speak of the ship of fools. But it's not essentially so, because if you take Plato seriously, then what the Politeia is an explication or articulation of this divine primordial paradigm, to which the soul of the philosopher has access by anamnesis, by the memory of that which makes up the universe. And I'm not so.
Yeah, just to jump in. What I understand from the question by essentially mimetic is, Plato has given us a portrayal of a discussion in a cave, right? Socrates meets someone and they go to an evenings.
But Plato was there.
Yeah,
Plato was there. Homer was not on the battlefield.
Yeah,
of the War of Troy, and then
but you would concede that this didn't exactly happen as. No.
But if mimetic, by the way, means that it is trying to resembling something as it happened, or as one perspective of it. And I find, to be honest, I find it a bit subversive. I find it a bit maybe splitting hairs to say the Politeia is a dialogue and you can't really do this because that's already mimetic in its entire essential structure. I mean, are we looking at the content of the book or purely at the form? I think you would say purely at the form. But then with Hegel, you would say, well, form and content go together. And the content is about finding that which is, as opposed to that which only seems. And as we've seen now in just this discussion,
I think
is how much
structure. That's another word for form, I think.
Yeah, but you see, but what is it that they're trying to do? They are the author is very aware of the difficulty of this interplay between shadows and that which is revealed, and how difficult it is to at all get to that which is or could be regarded as being properly. So, because the question actually sounds like it's almost like nefariously done in a way that it's mimetically structured, and there's something he conceals from us. Why is it mimetically structured again? Is it because if you're actually there as Plato and your teacher is Socrates, and what you do is to sit down and write, and then of course you bring in your own thoughts as well through the figure of Socrates and through the other figures too. But he's not so to be very, very Platonic now here. With Plato it would be mimesis only then, not when you actually. So it's not because, remember, the carpenter looks towards the idea and then makes one specific particular table, which is not the table itself in the universal, but it participates in the universal idea. So what Plato is doing is not to mimic some conversation, or to imitate something, but actually to go towards that which is brought about in dialogue, as he says, in dialectics, in dialectics, and in this bringing about, there is, as he says himself, there is a danger as well. And that's what he's trying to say, rather than he's just mimicking something. So I don't agree with the first with the premise of the entire question. I don't agree with it. I think that it's slipping something in that's not fair to Plato, and that actually, to be honest, derails from the genuine question of concealment, unconcealment, and shadows and light and darkness that the text addresses.
Okay. No, I think there's more merit to it than that. I mean, just go back to what we said before about particulars, and just imagine a text like Spinoza's Ethics, okay? Completely existing in the general, in the geometrical. It's a series of. It's based on Euclid's geometry.
Yeah.
It takes and it tries to solve the problem of human ethics in a purely geometrical Euclidean way, and that is what I think, based on the content of Plato's work. You said that form and content go together. I think they can, and sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. I think sometimes they don't.
No, they always do. And if they don't, then there's no content. So there you go.
Right, I disagree with that entirely. But if content always or necessarily dictated form, then that would be the form that this book would be written in, because that is what this book, the content of this book, says that knowledge, that says is the way you get knowledge. It's in this purely, it's by abstracting away from the particular to the general, whereas Aristotle, by opposite, is saying no, we need to look among us, we need to remain in the particular, in the realm of the particular.
But then Plato does this as well. I would say Plato does exactly this, but acknowledges that we need to go, but we need that it needs that the particular can only be properly thought if the universal is brought into the thought as well. So he's not moving entirely, not at all. That's why there's the move back into the cave.
Yeah. I mean, that's true, but he could have written this without
No.
without.
That could have. What actually has what has been written is what's important.
Yeah, I know that's the question, but he could have, let's say, per impossibile, written this in a completely different. Without any of the quotations from Homer, without any of the great pictures, the analogies of the sun and the cave. He could have written this philosophy as the pure mathematics, as simply.
No, but he says. Sorry, but he says about pure mathematics and geometry. He says in the analogy of the line that those always just work on hypothesis, which means positing. They never actually get behind their own presuppositions. So it is in the process and in the progress of going through the particulars towards the universal, to see that the universal has already been there, that the dialogue moves.
Yeah, that's all fine, but there still doesn't need to be. Socrates was walking one day with X, and he saw this, and he walked into a cave, and there was wine being drunk, and Thrasymachus threw himself at them. There is a content to this in which all those things are unnecessary.
Yeah, but why is that relevant?
Because that's the question we're dealing with. If he believes that all those things are unnecessary, why has he added in all these flourishes, these poetic illustrations, these quotations from Homer, which he doesn't need?
Yeah, but your judgment is they are illustrations. They're not just illustrations. They're extremely important.
They may be important, but they're important, but they're illustrations. They're not necessary.
Of course they're necessary. They're necessary because he gets to, for example, when he quotes Homer, where he actually says, he very clearly quotes, up until here in the Iliad, Homer is fine, but here at line 45, Homer goes astray. Why? Because here Homer begins to speak in a voice that isn't his and starts talking about
I'm not talking, but not even when he's not talking about Homer, he's using Homer. When he's talking about something completely different, he says, as Homer says. I mean, just in that what we were talking about at the end, he just throws in quotations, not completely separate from the discussion of poetry. When he's not even discussing poetry at all, he'll bring in talk of Homer. Lines from because as we said, he loved Homer, and as I said last time, it started as a playwright, so he's kind of complicit in his love for these things, as Plato, as an individual, and not as we have to. I think you're just thinking about this far too purely. Plato was an individual, a living, breathing human being.
Yeah, but then but then that is not a fair premise. That it's essentially mimetic. But if he's a living, breathing being, then this is a genuine dialogue, and he brings in that which comes to mind. I'm not reading it too purely. I'm saying it's necessary precisely because Plato is of his time. And of his time, he would, of course, quote Homer. And because it spoke to him and to others. And so I just don't think that it's essentially mimetic in this sense of trying to... Because, no, if it's... Stay with Plato. If it's essentially mimetic in terms of Plato, then what it says is the following. It's trying to imitate in a third degree of truth that which is. So with this statement then alleges is that Plato is a mimetic, is someone who is removed from truth by the third degree.
Yeah.
And that's...
Can I just read the
I
first...
don't agree with that.
Just all right. The first lines of the Republic are this. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, the son of Ariston. I wanted to say a prayer to the goddess, and I was also curious to see how they would manage the festival, since they were holding it for the first time. I thought the procession of the local residents was a fine one, and that the one conducted by the Thracians was no less outstanding. after we had said our prayer and seen the procession, we started back towards Athens.
Yeah.
So this is what I understand the question.
No. Look. He is actually there. He is in the proper sense a historian. He's in the proper sense an eyewitness. He's eyewitnessing these festivals himself. He's not someone in the 21st century sitting at his desk writing about the Peloponnesian War.
I know. I grant all that.
That would be mimetic. That would be
okay. Well, I think
removed by the third degree.
Then fine. Then
that's what I mean. Removed by the third degree is that Homer was never on the battlefield of Troy, of the Trojan War, but he writes about it as though he had been, and that's what Plato says is dangerous in poetry, which is not to say let's ban all the poets, but as by the way Aristotle, as you know, says too, the poets lie too much, precisely because they claim to be eyewitnesses, which is very important in Greek culture, by the way, to be a proper eyewitness, which is again is what history, and this is just as a thought, just maybe anyone who listens, think about this. Why is it that the Greek word for eyewitness becomes the English word for history, which now means that anyone can have any opinion on anything that happened at any time, however far removed. And that puts us back right into E.M. Foster's The Machine Stops, where all they're concerned with are ideas of, for example, the Aboriginal time of Aboriginal music in Australia. That's mimetic. That's completely removed from where we are. You see, that's what I think a mimetic means.
Okay.
If you think that mimetic means, telling something that where they were, that's not how I understand mimetic. That's why I disagree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On that lively note.
No. You have the last word, and then I'll.
No, I grant everything you're saying. I was just trying to be a bit more generous to the question than perhaps you are with your absolute strict interpretation of it.
Yes, you have to be very strict with these things.
Sure.
Because if someone says it's essentially mimetic.
But Plato is doing more than just describe what he saw. You'll grant that.
Yeah.
Not everything in this happened did he see.
No, but
not every word that was uttered.
That particular passage at the beginning obviously must have been something he's witnessed a couple of times.
I think that's more than we can say.
It must have been memories from whenever those celebrations took place. Why not?
Well, why not? Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. It must have. It's not necessary.
So you think that it already begins with a mimesis? It begins with this kind of an imitation.
I think it's
of something he never.
It's immaterial.
Again, very,
that's
very
what
clear.
I'm saying.
No.
It's immaterial.
No, it's very material. Does it begin with something he never witnessed?
Well, we'll never know. We'll never know, and it doesn't matter.
Well, but it does matter because that's what this question is about. The question is about: does it begin with, or is it purely something that Plato doesn't? And it goes, and actually don't forget about the beginning of it, because what this question actually alleges is, very, very strictly, you have to be strict, is that Plato claims to have any access to truth, but is actually removed by the third degree from it to quote from Plato. And that's why I think it's a very weird question. It's very, very strange. And because if it's positive, it's the following. It's essentially mimetic. Essentially mimetic means it can never get out of its own mimicking. So it's actually what the text is doing is not doing at all what it claims to do. So what this question alleges is literally to say the entire Plato's Politeia is just mimesis. Don't read it. It's just a lie. It is to be strict with Plato
on Plato's own terms.
Yes, exactly. Yes. Yeah. And then he actually says a paradox, and a paradox, you have the word doxa, which is mere appearance, and a paradox is is a doxa that paralyzes. So we have to take this seriously.
But you're not Plato. You don't have to read these terms in Plato's terms. You can read. This is a question to you and me. What do we mean by mimetic? This isn't what Plato means.
No. That's not how it works. But what do I mean? What do you mean? I think we have to read it if it's posited towards the text, because he does not, think. What do you think? He actually says Surely Plato could see this, which makes me wonder if the paradox is intentional. So he does talk not about any interpretation, he talks strictly about Plato. Strictly. You see? And so if it's strictly about Plato, then let's stick with what Plato actually says about mimesis and about essence, and which is not a Platonic term, and about doxa and intentionality. So, these are allegations. These are really severe allegations, I think.
I mean, if he's saying Plato might mean something by the paradox, it's not an allegation. If it's intentional, then it's not an allegation. Maybe he's saying Plato's playing with us.
Okay, that's a different way of reading it. So what is he playing with then? I mean, Plato.
That's the question.
I still don't agree with the first part.
Okay.
Because look, you should never say give. I mean, the wording is so strict. The wording is not. It seems to be that on some level the Politeia could be considered mimetic. No. It's the whole thing is mimetic. The whole text is on the third degree removed from aletheia. That's why this question is, I find, really, really strange, to be honest.
You said it was a good question a couple of minutes
it's
ago.
Good. Yeah, of course it's good. It's good doesn't mean that it's fair.
Okay.
It's good doesn't mean that I agree with it. It's a good question because it points to how, a question reveals something about the one who asks it, right? This is a positing. This is an hypothesis that's being posited, which is simply is stated as true. It's stated as true that the entire text is a paradoxical mimesis. And however, if it were posited in a different way, which it isn't, then one could point to something else, which we've done anyways without the question, which is that what Plato himself does the entire time throughout the text, which is to struggle with shadows and the interplay of light and darkness. That's what we've talked about. That's what obviously is shown in book 10 again, where he gives very clear indications again what it is that he thinks good narrative should do, and where mimetics goes wrong, because they go away from that which is. And then again he brings in brings in dialectics as a way of going back to the arche, to the origin, and at the same time Plato warns against dialectics because it can lead thinking astray again. So I think that there's when you see how this develops over the 2,500 years up until Kant and Hegel and then Heidegger, what actually Plato does, it's almost all there. Just what isn't there, which is what German idealism saw, is the difference between logic and ontology. Any final remarks?
No, thank you very much. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for listening. And as Johannes says, leave any further comments, and if there are enough, then maybe we'll get to them in an appendix to the second part of this podcast.
More comments like this, and Chris and I will go berserk. We'll do it over Zoom again.
But that was a great question, because you got two completely different answers from the two.
But that's what this podcast is. You get very
excellent.
We should make this explicit. Chris is a new Aristotelian. That's fair, isn't it? More or less, is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay, say it yourself.
I wouldn't call you a liar if you call me an Aristotelian. Yeah,
it is a lie, though.
I don't call myself that, but I wouldn't dispute that.
There are no isms that apply to us, but Chris obviously is more Anglo American and analytic in your approach.
My work was on Moth and Nussbaum, if that makes sense.
And Aristotle.
Well, who is a neo-Aristotelian.
And I'm obviously a bit more what people call in this country continental. And I think that the tension here, and we've read Nietzsche together twice now, Zarathustra, and the other one was
The
Tragedy. We've read Tolstoy together, What Is Art, actually a book that I wasn't even aware of until you mentioned it to me. And maybe we should, I will just tell the story, where at your house, where the idea for the podcast originated years ago, when I said to you, let's just read books together, and then we started reading books, and we didn't record any of this. So we read Zarathustra together, we read the Nicomachean Ethics together, and had conversations over Skype, because I was a bit further away from where you are. And then at some point we decided to actually start publishing. And I think the appeal of this is a completely different way, but you can see that there are always points of convergence where actually a thought from Chris will get me to think about things differently, and I have to be more precise, and just certain wordings remind me of something that and also just things that that I'm not aware of,
and vice versa, of course.
But yeah, not that I know anything, but oida udeneidos, keep it Socratic. So we'll say it again. Chris and I both are available for tutoring, and Chris, I think we should point out he's a very good. We know each other from Warwick. He was a very good teacher at Warwick as a PhD student, and I think you'd be more than happy to have a few private students to read text. For example, Mark Aurelius. It's always good to have guidance, right, with text. I mean, none of us we read the Republic together, and then we read it together and go through it. It's never good to just read on your own. I think it's always good to have guidance. So just contact Chris through the form. There will be a link just down below, and we're all looking forward to the course that Chris will put together for us. And I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this very last minute, and thank you, Chris.
Thank you,
as always. Thanks.